Okay, this should be a quick little tutorial. I'm just going to go over the idea of what a synapse is. Synapse is such a beautiful word, one of my favorite words in the English language. Synapse is basically a word for a connection. It's a special type of connection between our neurons which allows them to communicate or connect together. Really one of my favorite words. So synapse is a junction between two neurons, and it's across which an electrical signal can pass. And so our body contains up to 500 trillion synapses, 500 trillion connections between our neurons. So especially those interneurons often have several connections between different cells. So there's obviously a lot more connections than there are neurons, because each one has lots of connections to other ones. But 500 trillion synapses. That's such a fantastically massive number. That's, so many more than there are people on the planet, Massive, massive number of connections. Anyway, what does a synapse look like? Well, basically we've got one end here. So if this is the end of one neuron, where does the neuron end? If you watched my last tutorial, you'll know it always finishes it. So this would be the axon terminal. And the start of the next one, the bit that always picks up signals, this would be a dendrite. So it's the dendrites of a neuron that actually pick up the signals. So basically what we've got here, the first step is an electrical impulse comes down to the axon terminal, and it reaches the axon terminal, and somehow we now have to jump the gap and carry on the signal into the dendrite of the next neuron. So how does that happen? Well, when a nerve impulse arrives at the end of a neuron, so here it triggers the release of a neurotransmitter or neurotransmitters, which are small chemical molecules from synaptic vesicles. Synaptic vesicles are a fancy way of saying synapse, the connection here. Vesicles means bubbles. So on the end of the axon terminal here, we've got these small bubbles, little pockets that contain these chemical messengers. And when the electrical signal reaches the end here, those electrical signals or messengers are released, and they can float across the gap, and basically they'll attach to little receptors on this side, and basically activate the signal to carry on the other side. So here we go, the neurotransmitters diffuse across the synaptic cleft, across the gap, and bind with the receptors on the next neuron. So this was the axon terminal. They bind to receptors on the dendrites of another neuron, and then the nerve impulse will basically start going down that neuron. So this is how neurons can actually connect together. So it triggers another impulse in the next nerve cell. This is also one place where drug companies sort of design drugs. So there are some drugs will block these receptors so that we can't activate a nerve impulse, but only in certain neurons, certain parts of the brain. And some of those drugs are used to treat things like depression, so it stops activating the parts of the brain that make us depressed, or things like that. So some drugs target or either help to increase or reduce basically the messages being passed from one neuron to the next. So one more time, nerve impulse comes down, reaches the axon terminal. Little bubbles, little vesicles full of neurotransmitters, release them into the gap. Alright, those neurotransmitters, those little chemical messengers, bind to receptors on this side and on the dendrite, and the electrical impulse carries on, is passed on, essentially carries on now down this neuron. So another impulse is triggered in the next neuron. So that, guys, that's basically a synapse. So we'll leave it there, and we'll get into the next tutorial.